So what is the actual dynamic range and rolling shutter readout times of the Mavic 4 Pro's 3 cameras? Well, let's test it out. The 3 cameras on the DJI Mavic 4 Pro's gimbal are really quite impressive. They're able to produce beautiful images and video no matter what conditions you throw them in. But what makes the camera package on the Mavic 4 Pro interesting is that all 3 cameras use sensors from the Chinese company OmniVision. So how good are these sensors? Have they reached technological parity with Sony? Well, let's take a deep dive and find out. We're going to test dynamic range scientifically by using a Xyla 21 dynamic range test chart illuminated by a 10,000 lux light source. DJI claims 16 stops of dynamic range here. Let's find out. And for the rolling shutter readout speed test, we're going to be using a stroboscope with the frequency set to 200 Hz and a duty cycle set to 0.5. Alright, and let's start with the rolling shutter tests. At 25 frames per second, all 3 16:9 resolutions of the main camera take 29 milliseconds to read out. The Cinema 4K readout skips a little bit of the top and bottom of the sensor, so it reads out faster. Thankfully, once we switch to 50 frames per second, the readout speeds up a lot and we are now only seeing a readout time of 16 to 17 milliseconds. As a reference, 15 milliseconds of readout is considered good for video. Interestingly, the 9:16 vertical crop modes, which read out the entire vertical height of the 4:3 aspect ratio sensor, actually has similar readout times to the 16:9 modes, which suggests that they're basically just speeding up the readout for these modes. And finally, for the 120 frames per second high-speed modes, the sensor probably uses a combination of cropping and line skipping to give us a really fast readout time of just 6 milliseconds. Now, onto the 2.5 times camera, the 25 frames per second readout time improves dramatically to 17 milliseconds, while the 50 frames per second readout time is now at 15 milliseconds, which is considered pretty good for video. The 9:16 vertical crop modes are a little bit weird here, with the 25 frames per second mode likely doing a full sensor readout, while the 50 frames per second mode is likely doing line skipping. And as usual, the line skipped and cropped 120 frames per second mode is the fastest. Interestingly, when we get to the 6X camera, the 25 frames per second mode slows down to 20 milliseconds, however, the 50 frames per second mode, likely with the help of line skipping, speeds up to 10 milliseconds. And yeah, the readout speed results of the 9:16 vertical crop modes does suggest that there is a readout speed bottleneck within the OV50 sensor itself, as it cannot speed up the readout unlike in the main sensor. So yeah, the readout speeds on the Mavic 4 Pro's cameras, especially the main sensor and the 6X sensor, isn't all that impressive. For comparison, the same size and same resolution Micro Four Thirds sensor in the Lumix GH7 can read out 16:9 in 13 milliseconds, and the full 4:3 sensor in 20 milliseconds. Then again, to be fair, the majority of the stuff you'll be filming with the Mavic 4 Pro likely won't involve a lot of fast lateral movement or a lot of whip panning, in which case, rolling shutter artifacts basically won't be visible. Alright, now let's move on to dynamic range. With the main camera on the 4K 25p mode, 14 stops of dynamic range are clearly visible with a very faint 15th band. So let's give it 14.5 stops. Interestingly, despite the faster readout, the 50p mode has the same 14.5 stops of dynamic range. This suggests to me that the Mavic is simply speeding up the super sampled readout for the 50p mode. And the results are the same when we bump the resolution on the main camera to 6K for both the 25 frames per second mode and the 50 frames per second mode. Interestingly, the D-Log-M color profile has a lower base ISO. This actually lowers the noise floor and makes the 15th stop more apparent above the noise floor, so we're gonna give D-Log-M 15 stops. Now, switching over to the 2.5 times camera on 4K 25p, we're seeing a very faint 15th stop, which is even fainter than the one on the main camera, so we're gonna give it 14.25 stops. And this result also holds true for 50 frames per second. And interestingly, D-Log-M also brings the 2.5 times camera up to a solid 15 stops. And switching over to the 6x camera on the 4K 25p mode, we see 14 stops of dynamic range. There is no 15th stop, it's completely black. And switching over to 50 frames per second, the line skid readout kicks in and we start to get a penalty in terms of noise, and also the dynamic range drops to 12.5 stops. And unfortunately, switching over into D-Log-M also doesn't help a lot. And I compared the All-I codec, which is only available in the 512GB model, to the H.265 codec, which is available in all models of the Mavic 4 Pro. And good news, there are no differences in dynamic range. So if you buy the base model Mavic 4 Pro, you aren't missing out on anything. Well, that was actually pretty impressive. Even though it didn't reach 16.5 stops as claimed by DJI, we have to remember that a cutting-edge Micro Four Thirds camera like the Lumix GH7 can only really manage around 13 to 14 stops of dynamic range. Alright, and that's it. Thanks for watching.